Most of us are familiar with the Chernobyl disaster that rocked the world on the 12th of April, 1986. But in the decades that have passed since then, we've learned a lot about the consequences of the meltdown and the efforts that have been made to ensure that the area is as safe as possible. Number 10. The true scale of the impact that the Chernobyl disaster had on the surrounding area and some parts of Europe is hard to fathom, mostly because much of the damage caused by the leaked radiation only started presenting itself long after the explosion occurred. Several people lost their lives while combating the fire at the plant and during cleanup operations that took a very long time to complete. But the released radiation was in no way localized, and the long-term effects on the residents of Pripyat, other neighboring towns, and countries as far away as Sweden only became apparent years later. In the first 2 decades that passed following the disaster, an international team of 100 scientists calculated that around 2,000 people lost their lives as a direct result. And in the decade after that, the number fell drastically to about 50. According to a report released by the Chernobyl Forum, as many as 1,000 on-site reactor staff and emergency personnel were exposed to massive amounts of radiation in the first 24 hours following the blast. And in the 12 months following that, 200,000 more were exposed. This resulted in more than 4,000 cases of thyroid cancer being reported over the years, though it should be noted that among those affected, 99% of patients survived. The men and women who risked their lives to make the area as safe as possible should truly be hailed as heroes. But there is further cause for concern, as thousands of people are still living in areas that were contaminated as a result of the accident. Ukraine and Russia were understandably the worst affected in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. But Belarus is also considered to be highly contaminated by radiation, and it's estimated that around 5 million people live in the areas in that country that can be considered risky. At least 100,000 residents live in areas that have been classified as under strict control, but it's been suggested that this classification may be outdated and that these numbers need to be revised. Most of the people received relatively low doses of full-body radiation exposure, and according to several studies, no evidence has been found that this has had an effect on fertility or that it's caused any increase in congenital malformations. When the Soviet Union finally admitted to the true scale of the accident, more than 116,000 people were evacuated from the worst affected areas, and a further 230,000 were forced to flee lesser affected areas in the weeks that followed. But by this time, the radiation had already started taking its toll. The relocation efforts proved to be very traumatic to those who were forced out of their homes, and thanks to myths about what would happen to those who remained in contaminated areas, some people started suffering from paralyzing fatalism. This means that they would feel that there's little that could be done to improve their situation, since they've been falsely led to believe that their fates have been sealed. The symptoms of this state of mind include a lack of ambition and display an uncommon amount of apathy. The psychological effects that the disaster has had on people affected by it are clear, but they've also had to deal with the possibility of future health issues, such as cataracts and cardiovascular diseases. Number 9. When it became apparent that something was wrong at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on the day of the disaster, staff working at the time were told to take dosimeter readings to ascertain how much radiation was being released into the surrounding atmosphere. Initial readings came back as 3.6 Rontgen, but it was then discovered that those specific dosimeters maxed out at that number, and it quickly became apparent that those readings could not be relied upon. It would later be discovered that the actual reading was closer to 20,000 Rontgens per hour, which is almost an unimaginable amount. Anyone who's exposed to 500 Rontgens is certain to lose their life, as is evidenced by the many people who perished while desperately battling to bring the plant back under control, which turned out to be a futile endeavor. Massive amounts of radioactive material were ejected from the plant thanks to the explosion, more than 400 times more than the material released by the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Furthermore, the Chernobyl explosion contained longer-lived radioactive isotopes, like cesium-137 and iodine-131, which are responsible for the long-term contamination and health issues in the surrounding areas. These were just 2 of more than 100 radioactive elements that were released into the atmosphere that day. But luckily, most of these elements are short-lived and hence were far less dangerous. As a comparison, the explosion at Hiroshima affected an area of around 8 miles from the center of the spot where the atomic bomb was dropped, whereas the Chernobyl explosion affected an area of about 100,000 miles in diameter around the plant. As for the biological effects that this release of radiation has had, which is measured in sieverts per hour, the numbers are startling. In the immediate vicinity of the reactor core, 300 sieverts per hour were released. Full body exposure of just 8 sieverts per hour, 37 times less, is considered fatal to humans within a few weeks. The heap of debris that fell into the circulation pump area released up to 100 sieverts per hour, and near the electrolyzers, between 500 and 100 sieverts per hour was released. Immediately after the blast, it's estimated that certain areas of Pripyat experienced up to 300 sieverts per hour, and considering that the town's residents were only evacuated days later, this led to many people eventually losing their lives. A study that was performed in 2009 found that the cooling towers at the plant were still releasing up to 1.5 microsieverts per hour in the interior, while the back of the towers were more radioactive, releasing more than 12 microsieverts per hour. The very roads surrounding Reactor 4, the unit that was involved in the meltdown, still give off readings of 2.6 microsieverts per hour. But one of the most dangerous objects that still exists in the Chernobyl forest is the metal claw that was used during cleanup operations. It's still extremely radioactive and has been found to be releasing about 336 microsieverts per hour, decades after the fact. One of the most worrying facts about the claw is that it's been left on the ground in the forest, and several people who have visited the forest, either legally or otherwise, happened upon it without any sort of warning. Number 8. According to news reports that were released in May of 1986, following the Chernobyl disaster, it wasn't just Pripyat and its neighboring towns that were affected by the released radiation, since it was found that certain parts of Europe were experiencing higher than normal levels of radiation. Just a week after the explosion occurred, every single country in mainland Europe had reported elevated radiation levels. The Iberian Peninsula was prepared for similar readings, but was eventually found to be unaffected. At the time, the entire world was on tenterhooks, since such a disaster had never occurred in our history before, and there was a great deal of uncertainty as to how many countries would be affected. Keep in mind that the first sign of trouble came from readings received in Sweden, more than 930 miles away from the plant, while the Soviet government scrambled to keep the disaster a secret from the rest of the world. When the truth was finally revealed, scientists started keeping an eye on the wind over Kiev and found that it was constantly changing not only in direction but in strength. This made it impossible to immediately estimate the amount of radiation that was being spread over Europe, and it caused a lot of uncertainty. Poland and Scandinavia had been affected by a southwesterly wind that blew in the wake of the explosion, but it soon changed to an easterly wind, and as a result, higher radiation readings were then reported in Greece, southwest Germany, and what was Yugoslavia at the time. France reported that it had seen an increase in atmospheric radioactivity, while the Netherlands decided to shelve its plans to shift to nuclear power after higher than normal readings were discovered there. Poland, East Germany, and Sweden also started to become concerned, and in some areas, farmers were told to keep their cattle indoors for the first few weeks, for fear that they would be affected by the released radiation. Residents were told not to drink collected rainwater, and to refrain from eating wild mushrooms and vegetables, since it wasn't yet known how badly they had been affected. Poland was the worst affected of the Eastern European countries, and as panic started to spread, residents started buying iodine and uncontaminated food. Iodine is known to aid in the prevention of radiation contamination, but in West Germany, the government started to warn people to take iodine pills in moderation. since the panic had caused several people to take too many, resulting in iodine poisoning. The government started limiting the supply of fresh milk from the worst affected parts of the country. Since the effects of the radiation had not been determined yet, these areas included Bavaria and Hesse, among others. In West Berlin, it was reported that no stock of iodine pills was left, as people scrambled to make sure they had an adequate supply. In Bucharest, citizens were warned to make sure their drinking water was potable before consuming it, and people in Belgrade were told to remain indoors if possible, or to spend as little time outdoors as possible. Romania reported sharp increases in the levels of radiation in the atmosphere, while in Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands, citizens were told to ensure their vegetables were properly washed before they were consumed. People in Italy were prohibited from buying or selling salad greens, and many of their imports from Europe were immediately banned. Number 7. In the immediate aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, scientists realized that the reactor couldn't remain in the state that it was, and the decision was eventually made to have it covered up by a shell that was constructed from concrete and steel. This structure was given the moniker the sarcophagus, and there's no doubt that it helped stop the spread of radiation, but since it was hastily constructed, it contained many flaws, and eventually water started to seep in, causing the shield to start corroding. There were fears that it would eventually collapse, resulting in even more dangerous irradiated debris at the plant, and so the decision was made to have it carefully dismantled. The initial sarcophagus was constructed by no fewer than 600,000 people, who were tasked with ensuring that the 220 tons of radioactive material at the site was properly covered. More than 14 million cubic feet of concrete were used in its construction, along with 16 million pounds of steel. Once it was installed, holes were drilled in the side of the shield so that the core could be observed from the outside. Observers were kept safe from the radiation thanks to filters that were installed in these holes, but it was always going to be a temporary safety measure. Construction of the structure started 2 months after the disaster, and it took 7 months to complete. Unfortunately, workers who were tasked with installing the shield neglected to seal off the building's joints and openings in its ceiling, and these are the areas where the water started to seep in. During the installation, 31 people received lethal doses of radiation and eventually lost their lives. 2 years later, it was revealed by the Soviet government that the sarcophagus was designed to only last for around 20 years, and that a secondary structure would need to be installed in its place. In 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the Ukrainian government launched an international competition to find its best design for the new structure. In 2004, it was announced that a design by British designers would be used, since it contained a sliding arch that could be moved into place with the minimum amount of effort. This would keep workers from being exposed to unnecessary amounts of radiation, and the old structure, as well as the reactor, would be fully covered. 2 French construction groups, collectively known as Novarka, won the contract to build the shell, which was named the New Safe Confinement Structure. It was constructed nearly 1,000 feet away from the reactor after the parts were shipped in from Italy, and once it was completed, it weighed around 32,000 tons. While this was going on, it was discovered that the original sarcophagus's roof was about to collapse, and scaffolding was added to keep it in place. By 2014, the framework of the new shell was moved into place, after which construction of the rest of the shell started, and the project was completed in 2016 and was installed in November of that year. Number 6. Scientists always knew that there would be dire consequences following the Chernobyl disaster, and that many of them would only become apparent many years later. They speculated about spikes in cancer diagnoses, people suffering from radiation sickness, and the effects that it would have on close-lying areas, such as the town of Pripyat. It was also known that further-lying countries would be affected in some way, but the residents of the town of Zipkov in Russia must have thought they were safe, since the town is located more than 100 miles from the site of the explosion. Mere days after the accident, many residents of Zipkov were rehearsing for their May Day parade during cloudy conditions. Suddenly, it started pouring down with rain, and the participants scrambled for cover. It seemed like any other cloudburst, but they could not have known that this downpour was far more dangerous. The following day, Sergei Sizov, a professor at a teacher training college, was in the midst of a lecture on how to detect and respond to a nuclear or chemical attack by enemy forces. This may sound strange to us, but at the time, this was something everyone in the Soviet Union had to learn. In order to learn how to do this, his students had to be taught how to read a military-grade Geiger counter, which measures ionizing radiation in the atmosphere. Sizov expected to switch the machine on and receive normal background radiation readings, but he could not have been more wrong. To his surprise, the counter jumped to levels that he'd only read about in nuclear attack textbooks, and he immediately knew something was wrong. He decided to contact the local civil protection headquarters to report what he had discovered, but they refused to believe him, stating these readings were not possible. At the time, Novozibkov was still an antiquated town, and his residents were mostly farmers who lived in wooden houses and relied on the land to survive. They would have had no idea that the nuclear reactor at Chernobyl had been exposed, not only because they lived 100 miles away, but also because the Soviet government hadn't made an admission yet. Novozibkov and the surrounding region are home to about 200,000 people, and it was found that the entire area had been affected by as much as 5 microsieverts per hour, though that number has since dwindled to 2 microsieverts. Nevertheless, any reading above 0.6 microsieverts per hour renders an area unfit for human habitation, and it's been estimated that several areas like this will be uninhabitable until at least 2176. The residents of Novozibkov were caught in the rain that day and could not have known that they were being drenched in radioactive water. And while there were very few immediate effects, worrying signs would start to emerge years later. Children were born with strange abnormalities, such as underdeveloped ears, for which they needed to undergo several surgeries. At that time, about 1,000 people lived in the area, but they all had to be evacuated in the wake of the disaster, and the entire town was demolished to ensure no one attempted to return to their homes. Initially, it was decided that Novozibkov would also be evacuated, and its 40,000 residents were informed of this. But the plan was eventually scrapped when protests were started by people who refused to be forced out of their homes. Number 5. As unlikely as it may seem, the exclusion zone around the Chernobyl plant has become a tourist attraction to those who dare to venture there. Though many areas still remain off-limits, and visitors must be escorted by a guide at all times. Those who have visited the area describe the atmosphere as eerie and almost ghostly, mostly due to Pripyat and the surrounding areas having stood empty for decades. But it's not only the silence and emptiness that have contributed to the darker legends of Chernobyl, as many people have reported seeing some very strange things in the years that have passed. One of the better-known instances of this concerns a creature that's been dubbed the Black Bird of Chernobyl. Workers of the plant spotted this massive winged creature just days before the explosion at the plant took place. They described it as black in color with red glowing eyes and the body of a human. Many people who heard about this have speculated it might be the Mothman, a similar creature that's been spotted around the world right before disasters, such as bridge collapses and massive earthquakes occur. Workers stated that it had a wingspan of at least 20 feet, and in the days that followed, they were plagued by nightmares and threatening phone calls from people unknown. They added that in the days leading up to the disaster, these dreams and calls intensified, but then disappeared after the core exploded. In an equally terrifying incident that took place in 1997, a nuclear scientist from the University of Buffalo, Andrei Korsakov, had traveled to Chernobyl to take readings, but what he found there instead left him baffled and terrified. On that morning, he wanted to arrive at the plant early, and at around 7:30 a.m., he made his way to the reactor building. He had just started taking some readings when, to his surprise, he heard someone calling for help as a fire had broken out, and they were struggling to contain it. The calls were barely audible, but he heard them several times, and he ran to get help. He reported what he had heard to the people who let him in, but they informed him he was the first person to enter that area in over 3 years, that there was no fire, and that no one else could have possibly been in the area at that time. Furthermore, anyone who wishes to enter that area is required to use their palm print as a password, and if anyone had entered without permission, an alarm would have been triggered. This strange event has never been explained. Number 4. When the Chernobyl disaster occurred, it didn't take long for residents to realize that no event of equal magnitude had ever taken place on our planet. Plans had to be formulated on the fly, and in many instances no one knew whether they would be effective, since no such measures had ever been needed before. Thanks to the gravity of the situation, many people started looking to the Bible for answers, and a startling discovery was made. The name Chernobyl is made up of two words, chemi, which translates to black, and bil, which in English means herb or stalk. There's an abundance of a plant called blackweed or black wormwood in the area, and it's this name that caused a stir among theologians and those with a good knowledge of the Bible, since wormwood is mentioned in the book's prophecies. The passage in question comes from the 10th and 11th verses of the book of Revelation, chapter 8, and it reads, quote, "The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter." Remarkably, on the 25th anniversary of the disaster, a statue was erected at the old town of Chernobyl. It features a figure called the Third Angel that was placed at the entrance of Chernobyl's Wormwood Star Memorial Complex, with a trumpet held up to its lips as if it were preparing to signal an incoming disaster. Whether this name was purposefully chosen to align with the prophecy remains unknown, but it's caused many people to start dreading what they believe to be the approaching end of the world. They've also pointed out that the prophecy mentions a star that burns like a torch, which they equate to the burning of the reactor core, that at first seemed to have been contained, but then suddenly worsened. Next, they note that the groundwater close to the plant flows very close to the surface, and that the nearby river Dnieper is the largest surface water system in all of Europe. In the wake of the disaster, there were fears that the reactor would burn down into the water table, and if this had happened, all of this water would have become radioactive and unsuitable to drink, leaving millions of people without a source of fresh water. When the Soviet Union started implementing nuclear power, it believed it would help turn around the stagnating economy, and the power plants were referred to as shining stars across the USSR. Some people believe that this is due to the fact that the nuclear reaction inside the core is similar to that of what occurs inside of a star. Furthermore, when the core exploded, it's estimated to have burned at around 8,400 degrees Fahrenheit, not much less than the temperature of our nearest star, the Sun. Number 3. Many people who are familiar with the Chernobyl incident are shocked to learn that the disaster of 1986 wasn't the first accident to occur at the plant, but this has been confirmed by KGB documents that have been declassified after being kept a secret for decades. The newly released papers date back to well before the disaster, as far back as 1970, and a total of 190 different documents have been made available to the public. Some of the details that have now come to light are startling to say the least. We now know that officers from the KGB and the SSR in Ukraine were tasked with keeping the Chernobyl plant safe, but they seemingly had other things on their mind. They were far more interested in fleshing out representatives of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, as well as German and Chinese agents. At the time, it was believed that each of these groups had hatched a plan to destroy the plant at Chernobyl, though no evidence has been found to support this. But they did not completely neglect their duties. They were also tasked with inspecting any materials that were shipped to the plant, particularly those that were used in its construction. According to the released documents, they repeatedly found problems with these materials and reported these shortcomings, and those in power in Kiev tried to rectify this. But the higher-ups in Moscow decided that these issues should simply be ignored. The result should have been predictable, but nothing more was done. As a result, the plant experienced as many as 8 different accidents between 1971 and 1981, some of which were because of operation error, but the majority of these accidents were caused by inferior building materials. In 1984, 2 years before the disastrous accident, the KGB did its best to make its concerns known and reported that the Chernobyl plant was an accident waiting to happen, as they had detected issues with the reactor core. But again, they were not taken seriously, and their plans fell on deaf ears. The plant was run in an environment of producing results rather than following the correct procedures, and as a result, many of the operators ignored what they had learned during their training in order to produce what was perceived as impressive results. As an example, one operator at the plant decided to catch a few fish in a nearby pond, which was known to be irradiated. He then sold the fish to people living in the area. This was unbelievably irresponsible, and the KGB reported this to Moscow, but they were ignored. In the days following the explosion, members of the KGB who were present reported that the accident had been staged in an effort to distract the Soviet Union citizens from the many other problems they were experiencing. These claims were investigated, but they were found to be unproven, and the government decided the meltdown had occurred due to mistakes made by the operator, rather than looking further into the possibility that it was caused by inferior building materials. Number 2. One major issue that had to be dealt with during cleanup operations at Chernobyl was what to do with the tons of radioactive material that were strewn around the area. These objects were incredibly dangerous and could even today lead to someone losing their lives if they were to come into contact with them. For example, the uniforms worn by first responders, mostly firefighters, were left in the basement of the Pripyat hospital, and these items will remain there for many more years since they remain extremely irradiated. But not too far from the plant lies an area that's even more hazardous, and which will remain untouched for what's predicted to be thousands of years to come. When the citizens of Pripyat were evacuated, they were forced to leave without most of their personal possessions, including their vehicles. These cars, trucks, buses, and vans had become irradiated and were no longer safe to be around, but they couldn't simply be left where they were. Hence, the decision was made to move them to what's now become known as the Vehicle Cemetery, which is located just outside the city. While these vehicles are certainly dangerous, those that were used during rescue and cleanup operations are even more hazardous, since they were driven right up to the plant and would have been subjected to unthinkable amounts of radiation. These included fire trucks, ambulances, tanks, and normal vehicles driven by people who'd been ordered to assess the situation at the plant. But when all was said and done, it became clear that these vehicles had to be removed from the area and placed somewhere where they would not be a hazard to anyone. If left unchecked, this would cause further contamination, and so a drastic plan was put into motion. All of these vehicles were driven into a field in the village of Burykivka, which was situated about 7 miles from the plant where they were parked, never to be seen again. Before the disaster, the village was home to just over 220 people, but they were all forced to evacuate, and it now no longer appears on the register of settlements, as if it never existed in the first place. Before these vehicles were moved there, about 30 trenches were dug in the field, and much of the radioactive material that was collected was dumped in and covered up with soil. The vehicles were then moved into the field, where they remained for many more years. The site remains a popular tourist attraction, despite the fact that the vehicles have been removed, and it's still situated in the exclusion zone. Number 1. Just about everyone in the world suffers from some type of phobia, whether it's considered to be a rational fear or not. Anyone can understand a person being afraid of heights or narrow spaces, but some phobias seem to defy belief. For example, thousands of people suffer from the fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of their mouth. And I'm not just talking about dreading it either. These people suffer from a medically diagnosable, life-changing fear. Some sufferers are able to eat very small amounts of peanut butter, but for the most part, they avoid going anywhere near it. One very modern fear is called nomophobia, the fear of suddenly realizing that your cell phone is missing. It also includes an extreme fear of your phone running out of battery or having no cell service. While this fear can be rationalized in emergency situations, it's believed to mostly affect individuals who are addicted to their phones, since they're worried about missing out on an event or not having contact with someone. Then there's optophobia, which is the fear of opening one's eyes. This is often mentioned in the same context as agoraphobia, which is the fear of open spaces. since sufferers often choose to remain indoors or in darkened rooms. Some of us may see these phobias as ridiculous, but they are very real, as is another fear called radiophobia. This is the fear of ionizing radiation, and it's caused many people to struggle with their daily lives since the Chernobyl disaster. One of the major issues for sufferers of radiophobia is that the radiation is invisible, and hence they never know whether they're in danger or not. This often causes them to assume the worst, and it starts affecting their daily routines and eventually their lives as a whole. One example of this was recorded in a medical journal after a child visited a hospital and was found to need x-rays after breaking his leg. After this was done, he was returned to his mother, but she was unable to touch her own child since she suffered from radiophobia and was convinced the child had become dangerously radioactive as a result of the x-ray. The doctor who had taken the x-ray explained that as soon as the machine was turned off, any radiation that was present dissipated almost immediately, and there was no danger to her son. Many people who are affected by the phobia aren't as concerned with the radiation itself, but the effects that it could have. It's known that radiation can cause cancer in some people who've been exposed to it, and so sufferers fear that they've already received a high dose of radiation, and that it's only a matter of time until they start noticing the symptoms of cancer. Some people suffer flare-ups of the phobia, for instance, when they hear about an accident at a nuclear plant, or when there's talk about nuclear weapons being constructed. But for others, it becomes permanent, and it's often a debilitating way of life. Many cases were reported in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster, and after the accident at the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan in 2011, experts have stated that these fears are usually due to an overestimation of the dangers of radiation. But that fact doesn't make the fear any less real, no matter how irrational it may seem to the rest of us. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.